frustration seems to come with the territory of being a game players need to dedicate their decisions in. It might feel unfair to be locked out of fighting, but if you had been more tactical, had the foresight to not go running into tight spaces without knowing where they led, those sorts of deaths are almost entirely avoidable. Once the player adapts to the game's terms, most challenges they face will not fall into the category of feeling unfair, but it's interesting to think about how much the role of agency affects the player's sense of fairness. If I died because I hit the wrong button, that's on me. If I died because the enemy locked me out of movement, that's unfair. Such seems to go the conventional argument, at least. Another culprit people often point to in the fairness conversation is the unreliable lock-on, especially as it relates to bosses. Many bosses are able to escape the lock-on by zipping around the area fast enough. The player's axis of movement is locked to the angle the camera points to, and I think that if players actually got to test what it'd be like to have an enemy jump across the arena without the lock-on breaking, they would lower the temperature on this argument a bit. Imagine rolling into a certain direction only for the entire angle of action to swap mid-button press, and you might get a good idea of why the lock-on breaks are done. I agree that they aren't the most elegant solution, but I think they are better than the alternative I just described. A better point in regards to lock-on is that boss fights should always lock on to the boss once the lock-on is triggered. Pressing the right analog stick is how you trigger the lock-on, but if there is no enemy for it to gravitate towards, then it simply centers the camera behind the player. That is a tactic no one has ever intended to use in the middle of a fight, and furthermore, when the player is trying to get a lock-on during an encounter, boss or mob, if the game fails to register it and just centers the camera, it can be a death sentence. Centering the camera is a mechanic which I think these games would be wholly better off ditching. It's never useful and often lethal. Puritans might argue that this makes locking on more skill-intensive, but considering some of the quality of life improvements we've gotten from Software over the years, that argument seems like a non-starter to me. I don't think there's any good reason for this mechanic to be maintained. Going back to my point about separating unfairness and the feeling of unfairness,